Certainly, bipolar disorder is still one of the most misunderstood mental health conditions. Still, too many people think it's characterized by these ups and downs in mood, these mood swings. And sure, you can have mood swings in bipolar disorder, but you can have that in many mental health conditions, and that's not the defining feature of bipolar. What defines bipolar disorder are states of mania, and that's what I want to talk about in today's video. And mania is not just feeling really good or having an elevated mood. It's one of the most destructive things that can happen to someone's mental health. It's where your brain starts to lose its grip on reality. I've seen it destroy careers, end marriages, and nearly end lives. And the scariest part about mania is that you may not have any insight that it's going on. You may think you're living the best version of yourself, but everybody around you sees that you're burning your life down. So today I'll walk you through what mania actually is. And to help do that, I'll share with you two case examples from my own training that really illustrate the two various forms that can take on. One very obvious and the other a little bit more subtle, but in both situations, highly destructive. For those of you new to the channel, welcome. I'm Dr. Robert. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist. And as always, these are just educational videos, not medical advice. And if you're experiencing any mental health symptoms, please seek the care of a local mental health professional. So let's jump right into that first case example. I'll call this patient Laura. Of course, all details changed for patient privacy. And I'll never forget walking onto the inpatient unit. I was still in medical school, my first year. I was just shadowing a psychiatrist to see if I was still even interested in psychiatry. And as soon as I walked onto the unit, I saw a lot of commotion. Some patients looked concerned, others entertained, as this young girl, probably in her early 20s, just running around the unit in her hospital gown. She's yelling, screaming, laughing, and the staff is chasing her. And they look very concerned. They're not amused, but she certainly is. And what I would learn later is that she was living a very normal life just a few weeks back. She was a sophomore in college at the local university. She was a responsible, good student, had a lot of friends in college. And something odd started to happen several weeks back. First, she started to be sleeping less. She was staying up at odd hours in the night, kind of coming out into the common area. She also started to speak more rapidly. She started to have a lot of ideas, be very excited about things more so than was typical for her. And although she seemed a lot happier, she was also a bit more irritable. So if you challenged her, if you try to pin her to a topic of conversation, she'd get a little bit frustrated and maybe lose her temper. But as it started to escalate over the course of a couple of weeks, her speech got even faster, her behavior even more erratic, and her train of thought when people spoke to her at first seemed kind of coherent, but then people would start to realize something is really off with Laura. She is not being herself. Eventually 911 was called, she was brought to the hospital and admitted to the psychiatric unit against her will. And one day later, here she is running around the unit. So let's pause here to examine the characteristics of mania, because this is a pretty clear-cut case. This was not a diagnostic mystery on the unit. And the clear signs of that were this. One, she had a reduced need for sleep, so she was sleeping a lot less. A lot of times in mania, you can think of mania as this state where the brain is almost on overdrive. So you're sleeping less, you're talking a lot more, your ideas are racing, they're very fast, you're having many ideas that all of them seem really good, really important, but they might be flawed to someone else. But to you, if you're in a state of mania, they may seem very, very meaningful. She was also being a lot more impulsive than usual, a lot more irritable. Just in general, her perception of reality was very shifted, very altered. And it was very clear to everyone around her that something was definitely off. She was not in her right state of mind. But to her, everything was normal. She did not have the ability to recognize that her brain wasn't functioning as it usually does. Later that morning, the attending psychiatrist and I walked into her room after the staff had brought her back in. And she was a little bit more calm now, but she was covered by her bed sheet. And she would only talk to us through that. And I remember he was asking her questions, like, what's your name? What's your understanding of why you're here? What have you been studying in school? What have you been up to these past few weeks? But most of her answers, they were tangential. They didn't really answer the original question. They went in circles, and they just weren't very coherent. Another very classic feature of mania. That's disorganized speech, thought process, rapid speech. But luckily, Laura agreed to start a mood stabilizer, lithium, later that day, along with the antipsychotic. And a week later, she was actually back to herself. We were able to discharge her, and she was able to resume school a few months later, feeling a little bit embarrassed about what had happened, but at least with a diagnosis, clear follow-up, and therapy. So she had a lot of support, and she was able to get back to a normal life after this manic episode. That is the case for a lot of people with bipolar disorder. They experience some periods of mania, some periods of depression, but between these severe states, they're able to lead fairly normal lives. Also, to be clear, mania, depression, and bipolar, these aren't like several hour periods, several day periods. They last weeks at times. That's another thing that people get confused about in bipolar disorder. These aren't mood fluctuations that last hours or days. We're talking weeks. There's a sustained elevations or lows of mood that are very, very severe and drastic. That was a very dramatic, very clear-cut example of mania. But next I want to tell you the story of George. And his case of mania was much more subtle. And I would argue because of that, much more destructive. So I met George during my psychiatry training as a resident. So I already graduated medical school. And I was seeing patients in the clinic, and I walked into the waiting room to bring in the next patient. I could immediately tell that he did not want to be there. Next to him sat his wife. She kind of pulled him up by the arm and dragged him into the office. As soon as we were in the office, his wife told me, "My husband is ruining his career. Something is wrong. Please help us." So I looked at George to see what his input would be, and he just shakes his head and he's like, "You wouldn't understand. Nobody understands." His wife, looking very frustrated and frightened, then filled me in on some of the details. Apparently, for the past several weeks, George, who is a very successful attorney in his mid-30s, has had a very promising career ahead of him, had begun to act very, very different than his usual self. He was still sleeping fine. He wasn't having any change in his speech, other erratic behavior, impulsivity, but he began to become much more combative at work. He started sending these very aggressive emails at work, accusing his partners of running the firm inefficiently, that they couldn't look ahead to the future, what was coming. He believed, had a better way of running law. In fact, he had an idea of how to revolutionize how law would be practiced in the States. And there was a lot of AI involved in this. He had visions about how AI could be implemented, revolutionize law. On the surface, if you kind of just heard the initial bits of it, you'd be like, okay, this sounds promising, reasonable, grounded in reality. But the more you kind of probed him about it, asked him about it, would kind of give these kind of more vague answers, and you would recognize that, okay, there's an idea here, but there's not much logic behind it. And it seems like a very impulsive way to go about managing this idea, advocating for it too. Certainly burning a lot of bridges. Being early in my training at this point, I wasn't really sure what was going on. Was this a delusion? Was this just him coming up with an idea, being excited about it? What's going on here? But something was definitely off, and his wife, who knew him for 12 years, recognized something is very, very wrong with George. This is not him. But George was having none of it. He didn't want to be in that clinic. He actually left the appointment early, and his wife had to fill me in on most of the details, and he refused to follow up. He actually never came back to the clinic. A little fun tidbit. Before leaving the office, he handed me his card. And on the card, it said AI law, no going back. And he said if I fixed the whole situation with his wife, this unnecessary psychiatric evaluation, he would have me fully covered for any law services I would potentially ever need in the future as a medical provider. I could forget about having to pay malpractice insurance. He'd have my back. A very generous offer. And unfortunately for George, what happened next is it's not uncommon with this condition. He was not a danger to himself, others, so he wasn't able to be forced into any mental health treatment. So his wife kind of had to put up with him. And he started to just get more extreme with his ideas, more combative with his coworkers. And mind you, he was still sleeping well, he was still eating, he was maintaining some other hobbies like exercise, things like that, just to a lesser degree. But he was much more obsessed with this new idea that he had, this grandiose idea of AI law. And he was at some point banned from returning to work because they also recognized he's not fit to practice law right now. But he got very combative with them. He kept returning to the office, and eventually security had to be called. He got combative with security. Then 911 was called, and he was brought to the hospital for a mental health evaluation. And at this point, he was admitted to the psychiatric hospital for a 72-hour hold. So we had 72 hours to evaluate him and determine whether he needed further treatment or if he was safe enough to be released again. And he was kind of in that gray zone. So he was clearly damaging his life, ruining his reputation, his potential future career. But at the same time, he was still functioning enough to be able to care for himself. He wasn't in clear danger to others or himself. So we weren't able to hold him longer than 72 hours. We did have to discharge him, much to the frustration of his wife and family. And I never saw George again, but what I learned from my attending and continued to follow up with him and his family was that he continued to pursue these ideas, eventually moved into a hotel room away from his family so they wouldn't keep bothering him, bugging him about these things. He felt he had a lot more freedom, but he kind of continued to pursue this idea that didn't really have any foundation, any logic behind it. It was just an idea. Eventually, a few months later, the manic episode broke. So it kind of ran its course, which can oftentimes happen. And then he fell into a depressive episode. And that depressive episode was pretty severe. He gained some more insight into the damage he'd done, the potential lack of an actual business model, plan, or anything behind this idea. And he decided that he would take his own life. Luckily for George, he did reach out in the last minute to his wife and she brought him to the hospital. He was admitted again, and this time he did agree to treatment. I'm not really sure what happened to him afterwards, but I'm sure there was a lot of repair to be done to his career, to his marriage, finances, reputation, from this very destructive manic episode. But this episode also kind of shows that sometimes mania doesn't present in the very clear-cut ways, these very obvious ways where you can be like, oh, this person is definitely not mentally well. It can be a little bit more subtle. And that then allows you, unfortunately, to experience more consequences because of it at times. And I think it's really important to raise awareness of what mania is, because I think that too many people experience these mental states and the people around them aren't able to recognize it. And I think that they can go on for too long without people seeking help. And some things outside of bipolar disorder can cause mania as well, including like autoimmune conditions, like autoimmune encephalitis can bring on a manic-like episode. Drugs can certainly do it. Certain medications can trigger it as well. So it's not just a bipolar phenomenon, but it is the defining feature of bipolar. And I think it also brings up a lot of these interesting questions over how do we as society, as family members, friends of people experiencing these states, what are the best ways to intervene? I don't think we have a good answer about that, right? Because we can't force someone into treatment unless they're a very clear danger to themselves or others, which is the case, for example, in the first example of Laura. But for someone like George, where it's a little bit more subtle, how do we help these people? Do we just wait for them to burn through enough bridges, enough things for them to fall back into a depressive episode and help them then? It gets very complicated. A lot of ethical questions come up. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on this. So thank you so much for paying attention to the end. I really appreciate it. I hope you found this interesting, informative. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And I hope to see you next week. Thank you so much.